Becoming a whistleblower or police informant takes a lot of courage, and hence the authorities usually make sure that these individuals are protected. In some cases, though, this type of protection isn't enough, and an informant mysteriously disappears, usually at the hands of those that they're reporting against. Number 10. In September of 2024, Matthew Johnson and Christina Dixon, both of whom were 41 years old, were working as informants for the police when they suddenly went missing. On the 10th of September that year, the pair supplied the police with information that led to a large amount of illegal substances being found and seized in Richmond, Indiana. It was later revealed that the substances belonged to a known dealer, and that one of the informants visited his house that day. Either Matthew or Christina had entered the house of an unnamed dealer, pretending to be interested in purchasing from him. After they left, the police struck, and when a search of the house was conducted, the substances were located and the dealer was arrested. It then came to light that the substances belonged to a man named Dominique Washington, known to his friends as Nico, and that the first man was merely selling on his behalf. The sting had been a success, but unfortunately it would end in disaster. Investigators have since released information on what they believe happened next. They stated that on the 19th of September, Washington likely made contact with Matthew and Christina and arranged to meet up with them. He managed to convince them to get into his car, and once inside, they were forced to switch off their cell phones. While this was happening, the two informants were being watched by police officers, but they lost their two informants when Washington switched cars at one point. While still in the car, Matthew and Christina's lives were ended. They were driven to the St. Mary's River in Fort Wayne, where their bodies were removed from the vehicle and left for the police to find. Thanks to traffic cameras, it was later ascertained that Washington used a friend's car to lure the two victims, and he then switched to his own vehicle to end their lives and drive them to the river. After they were reported missing and eventually found, a coroner reported that Matthew and Christina's lives were ended with a firearm, a sharpened blade, and suffocation, respectively. Shortly after this, Washington was pulled over for a traffic stop, and when he was identified, he was taken into custody. His house was searched by the Indiana State Police SWAT team and the Fort Wayne Police Department. Thanks to evidence found there and information supplied by others, it's anticipated that more arrests will be made and that justice will be served in Matthew and Christina's cases. Number 9. The case of the disappearance and passing of 23-year-old Rachel Hoffman is truly tragic, as she was seemingly pressured into becoming a police informant, which would end up costing her her life. On the 22nd of February, 2007, Rachel was pulled over for a traffic stop, during which she was found to be in possession of less than an ounce of an illegal plant. As a result, she was placed under court supervision, but things would get much worse. On the 17th of April the following year, someone called the Tallahassee Police Department to complain about the smell of an illegal substance coming from Rachel's apartment. Upon their arrival, the same person stated that they suspected Rachel of selling the same substance, and the police knocked on her door. They asked whether she had any controlled substances in her apartment, and she immediately confessed that she did. When the apartment was searched, about 5 ounces of the plant were found, as well as other illegal substances that were stashed inside of her couch. She was charged with intent to distribute, which is a felony, and Rachel was facing prison time. But she was then told by an officer, Ryan Pender, that she may receive a reduced sentence if she were to assist them in apprehending her supplier. Rachel had spent 3 days in jail during her previous arrest, and no doubt had no desire to spend more time in prison. Hence, she agreed to become an informant, despite the fact that she'd been given no training and had never been involved in a police operation before. On the 7th of May, 2008, she was set to take part in a sting against 2 convicted felons with very little preparation. The police had supplied her with a wire so that they could hear what was happening, and that night she got into her car and drove to a public park in Tallahassee. She was told to dress casually, so she dressed in blue jeans, a t-shirt, and flip-flops. She'd been given $13,000 by the police to complete a transaction with the 2 men, and must have been extremely nervous by this point. She texted her boyfriend to let him know that she was about to start the sting, and he texted her back, wishing her luck and asking her to contact him once it was all over. She then called one of the men with whom she was about to meet, telling him she was about to arrive. She was told to purchase a large amount of 2 separate illegal substances and a firearm. She somehow managed to keep her composure over the phone, likely because she knew that 19 police officers were tracking her movements and listening in on the conversation. But then, the operation went very wrong. After Rachel got out of her car and approached the 2 men, they conducted a search and found the listening device that she had in her purse. To make matters worse, none of the 19 officers or the plane that was circling overhead could keep track of her, and she disappeared. They arrived at Rachel's boyfriend's house a short while later, asking if he knew where she was, but he stated he hadn't seen her. 2 days later, the gravity of the situation became all too apparent. Rachel was found deceased in a ravine in Perry, Florida. Her life had been ended with the very firearm that she was supposed to buy that night. It later came to light that the officers believed that, quote, someone had eyes on Rachel, when none of them did. Number 8. In 2010, 37-year-old Osama El-Atari was living in the lap of luxury. He owned several restaurants in Virginia and also worked at Buffalo Wild Wings locations that were owned by his family. He owned 2 Ferraris, 2 Lamborghinis, a Rolls-Royce, as well as a $4.5 million mansion. He was in the habit of sending money needlessly, as it's known that he bought a football jersey that belonged to Sean Taylor for a whopping $25,000 and would often buy lavish gifts for his family and friends. But his restaurants and extra work surely didn't earn enough to provide him with such riches, and he was soon placed on the police's radar. In 2007, he spoke to the security chief for the Pentagon's Defense Logistics Agency and managed to acquire fake police badges in exchange for doing business with the chief. When he applied for a liquor license in Virginia, he produced a badge and was reported when it was discovered to be a fake. He was arrested and then pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge. He was eventually released, but this didn't stop him from breaking the law. In 2009, he started committing fraud against several banks across the country, after which he started laundering the tens of millions of dollars that he had stolen. He was eventually tracked down in 2010, and he was apprehended. He faced up to 30 years in prison for each of the fraud charges, and 10 years for each of the money laundering charges, which made him a very desperate man. He agreed to become an informant and aided in the prosecution of United Bank Assistant Vice President Sadek who'd been a part of his fraudulent schemes. He remained incarcerated, but was hoping for a reduced sentence, and so he started gathering information from his fellow inmates, which he then passed on to the police. He was released in 2014, but 2 years later, his dealings would finally catch up with him. In February of 2016, Osama was reported as missing by his family when they couldn't make contact with him. One afternoon shortly after, the police were informed that he'd been found, but when they arrived, they found him sitting in his pickup truck in Marlboro, Maryland, deceased. He'd been attacked with a firearm. During the resulting investigation, 48-year-old Donald Clay was interviewed, since he was one of the last people to see Osama alive. At first, he stated he had no idea what had happened to him, but later confessed that he believed Osama had hidden millions of dollars overseas. He then held Osama captive with the aid of 2 other men, 26-year-old Taqwa Muhammad and 29-year-old Eric Garris, in an effort to have money transferred into a fake bank account. Investigators believe that Osama repeatedly told them that they were mistaken about the money, but his captors refused to believe him. One of the men produced a firearm and then ended his life, leaving the scene with just $100, which was stolen from Osama's person. Muhammad and Garris were tracked down and arrested. There's no way of proving this, but investigators believe that Osama really didn't have money stashed abroad, and that his life was needlessly ended. Clay was charged with first and second-degree murder, while Muhammad and Garris were charged with murder. Number 7. In May of 2014, 20-year-old college student Andrew Sadek became a police informant after he was caught selling $80 worth of an illegal substance while on the campus of the North Dakota State College of Science. unbeknownst to him, the man that he was selling to was a police informant, and Andrew was taken into custody. He had enrolled at the college after earning a scholarship at a state skills competition and had aspirations of becoming an electrician. But his ambition didn't end there. He told his friends and family that once he had completed his studies, he was going to study robotics, but he never got the chance as his life took a strange turn. After his arrest, Andrew was told by investigators that he might receive a reduced sentence if he agreed to work for them as an informant. With his future in jeopardy, he readily agreed. He was told by Richland County Sheriff's Deputy Jason Weber that he needed to set up further deals by a certain deadline, and that if he failed to do so, he would face felony charges and that he may spend as much as 40 years in prison. But this was not true, as it was later revealed that if Andrew had refused to cooperate, he would likely have been set free on probation. Unfortunately, Andrew had no way of knowing this, and he went ahead with the deal. He set up several sales, and on the day of the deadline, suddenly disappeared without a trace. His fellow students would report that he was last seen leaving his dorm building called Norgard Hall. He was dressed in blue jeans and a sweatshirt and was seen carrying a backpack. His disappearance was seen as very out of character, since he was set to graduate in a few weeks and would not simply have left on his own without informing his family. Searches were conducted, and his family appealed to him to come home, but to no avail. For the next 2 months, his family searched for him in desperation, and on the 27th of June that year, their worst fears were realized. Andrew was found deceased in the Red River in Breckenridge, Minnesota. His life had been ended with a firearm, which has never been found. The person responsible for ending his life has also never been identified, and in the aftermath, Andrew's family filed a lawsuit against the Southeast Multi-County Agency Task Force and the county sheriff's deputy, Jason Weber, but it was eventually just dismissed. Number 6. In 2003, officials in the US were left embarrassed when a carefully planned operation against a Rwandan tycoon failed and resulted in the demise of their most important informant. The case played out in Kenya, and the target of the sting was Felician Kabuga, who'd been charged with supplying funds to those responsible for the Rwandan tragedy that occurred on the 7th of April, 1997. The events that took place there resulted in a massive number of lives being lost, and in the days that followed, the story made headlines around the world. People were left outraged at the destruction and the violence that had taken place, but Kabuga was nowhere to be found. For some time, it was suspected he'd gone into hiding somewhere in Kenya, and that his location was being kept a secret by those serving under the country's president. Nevertheless, the investigation into the matter was never closed, and in 2003, investigators who were stationed in Nairobi saw a unique opportunity to progress the case against Kabuga. They started working closely with security services in Kenya, and in January of that year, 27-year-old William Munuhei decided to share what knowledge he had. He stated that he had certain pieces of evidence that could lead investigators to Kabuga, and he was recruited as an informant. Munuhei had worked with one of the president's close friends in the past, and hence had access to certain information that wasn't available to most. The operation started with surveillance, as Kenyan detectives positioned themselves to keep an eye on Kabuga's home. Kabuga was known to be on his way to the house for a business meeting, but didn't know that meeting had been set up by operatives in an effort to apprehend him. He never arrived though, and after 7 hours of patient waiting, the detectives had no choice but to leave. When they attempted to inform Munuhei of what had happened, they were surprised when he didn't answer their calls and failed to respond to their messages. When detectives were still unable to contact him 2 days later, they decided something had to be done, and they traveled to his house. He failed to answer the door, and so the decision was made to break in. The house was searched, and in the bedroom, they found Munuhei lying on his bed deceased. He'd been attacked with a firearm, and it quickly became apparent that his attackers had somehow gotten wind of the operation against Kabuga. Number 5. Lee Byung-Chul, a Korean lawyer, was seen as a serious obstacle to the presidential campaign of Lee Jae-myung in 2020. Byung-Chul had come forward as an informant and accused the presidential hopeful of having his legal fees paid by a third party, rather than doing so himself, as he'd been ordered to do at the time. Byung-Chul's accusations could not have come at a worse time for Jae-myung, since the presidential race was in full swing, and the allegations could easily derail his campaign if they weren't dealt with swiftly. Byung-Chul had approached a civil group in the country and claimed that the legal fees in question were in fact paid by an underwear company called Sangbang Wool. Jae-myung had accrued these fees while he was standing trial on charges of election law violations. He stood accused of spreading spurious information during the 2018 presidential election campaign, and while attending an interview on a television show, he was asked what role he had played in his brother's admission to a mental health facility. He stated outright that the matter was none of his concern and that he had no hand in it, but he would eventually stand trial and accrue fees of around $9 million. While this may seem like an extortionate amount of money, it makes sense considering the fact that he had as many as 30 lawyers who were employed to defend his case. One prosecutor who was on the team was paid more than $200,000 to represent him, along with a massive amount of stock. The trial dragged on for 2 years, and hence Jae-myung's legal fees had added up to an astronomical amount that he was likely unable to pay. Sometime after that, Byung-Chul approached the prosecutor and a man named Choi and engaged them in a conversation. They started discussing the payment, but unbeknownst to the prosecutor and Choi, the entire exchange was being recorded by Byung-Chul. In an effort to escape the charges against him, Jae-myung claimed that many of the 30 lawyers were colleagues of his who had agreed to defend him on a pro bono basis, since the trial was expected to last for years. After Byung-Chul's revelations came to light, Choi tried to backtrack by claiming that he and Byung-Chul had invented the accusations in hopes that they would receive donations to pay for the outstanding fees. This did little to help the case though, as the provincial government felt that Jae-myung could have simply used funds from the government's coffers to pay for the fees, rather than accept payment from the underwear company. In fact, 4 of the lawyers who'd represented him were paid with these funds, and one of these lawyers came forward to report that he had signed a separate contract when asked to represent Jae-myung. Hence, he was in no way involved with the suspicious payments. In 2022, Byung-Chul's sister contacted the police to report that she'd not heard from him and that she was concerned for his safety, since it was out of character for him to remain out of touch. Initial searches failed to locate him, but 3 days after he was reported missing, his family's worst fears became reality. He was found in a hotel room in western Seoul, where his life had been ended. He was just one of 3 people who had come forward with information that incriminated Jae-myung, and in the space of 2 months, they all lost their lives. Number 4. 44-year-old Donald McKay, an Australian businessman and campaigner, is believed to have been murdered for his role as an informant, but his remains have never been located, and his case has left many questions unanswered. At the time, McKay was living in Griffith, New South Wales, in Australia, and on the 15th of July, 1977, he was working at a furniture store that his family had owned in the town for more than half a century. At around 5:30 that afternoon, he shut the store and headed to the Griffith Hotel. His wife Barbara was meant to attend a meeting that night, and Donald was supposed to look after their children at their home while she was away. He was supposed to be home by 7 p.m., but he decided to stop off at the hotel first to have a few drinks, and there he met up with a few friends, and they spoke about his efforts to bring awareness to the fact that illegal plants were being grown in the area. Donald had been campaigning against this for some time, and for his efforts had made a few enemies. Once he finished his drinks at the hotel, he went to a liquor store and purchased a cask of white wine, and then set off for home to look after his kids. He was seen driving away from the store, but never arrived home, and has not been seen or heard from since. It was later discovered that Ian Salmon, one of Donald's friends, who also served as his solicitor, was working in an office building across the street at the time, but he would report that he didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. The other man was an accountant named Roy Briggs, who would state that he heard what he thought were the sounds of someone throwing up, followed by the sound of something akin to a whip crack. Later that evening, Barbara contacted Ian to ask if he had seen him since he hadn't arrived home, and Ian went out looking for his friend, but to no avail. Barbara didn't contact the police straight away, as she was hopeful that Donald had simply been delayed. But when he still wasn't tracked down by midnight, she decided to report him as missing, since it was out of character for Donald to stay away from home without informing her. Ian then came across Donald's vehicle in the hotel's car park. He noticed a handprint on the driver's side window, and to his dismay, spent cartridges, as well as a large amount of biological material. But when he approached the vehicle, Donald was nowhere to be seen. Those who knew Donald immediately started speculating that his disappearance was related to the fact that he'd become a whistleblower against those who were growing illegal crops in the area, and that he'd been attacked to keep him from revealing any more information. In 1986, a man named James Basley was convicted after he was accused of orchestrating the attack, along with George Joseph, who was found to have sold a firearm identical to the one used against Donald to Basley. Number 3. In 2018, 35-year-old David Cargill had grown increasingly concerned about the illegal substance trade that was growing in Anchorage, Alaska, his hometown. But unlike most people, he had decided to do something about the problem, and earlier that year, he'd agreed to work with the police as an informant. The PD Vice Unit had become aware of illegal trade that was taking place from a building on 66th Street, and after David volunteered to help, they tasked him with purchasing illegal substances and firearms from those operating out of the building. His wife, Deborah, stated that David wasn't doing this to receive accolades or praise, but rather because he wanted his 2 children to grow up in a safe environment, which wasn't possible as long as this unwanted trade existed in the area. He had seen the effects that crime and illegal substances had on people living in Anchorage, and he truly wanted to make a difference, but it was a decision that would change his family's lives forever. Furthermore, he had experienced addiction himself after he was diagnosed with diabetes. He'd been experiencing some complications and had been prescribed certain medications to which he'd become addicted. But he had, however, made arrangements to check into a rehabilitation center and was fully committed to overcoming his addiction. Before this could be done, he wanted to finish what he had started. Thanks to the purchases made by David, 2 men were identified at the building in question, and it seemed as though the operation had been a success. But then, the case took a sudden turn. After the 2 men were arrested, their attorneys were supplied with the evidence against them. This included video and audio of the purchases David had made, and as a result, one of the accused, a man named Scotty Matea, figured out that David was the informant who was largely responsible for their arrest. Just a few days later, David mysteriously disappeared. This was the first time that an informant working with this particular vice squad had gone missing. Deborah immediately started worrying that his work with the police was somehow connected to his disappearance, but she had no way of proving it. But her fears were confirmed on the 17th of October that year, when a utility worker who was performing his duties in a wooded area close to the Eklutna power plant stumbled across his remains. He immediately contacted the police, and when they arrived, it was found that David had been wrapped in pink saran wrap. In the immediate area, they also found blue tape and a pair of latex gloves that were likely used by whoever ended David's life. Evidence from the search conducted at the building on 66th Street contained a photo of a box of Fastline saran wrap, the same brand that David was found wrapped in, and a second search warrant was issued. During that search, the box of saran wrap was found along with the same type of tape that was found at the crime scene. They also discovered a firearm that was likely used to end David's life. Matea, who's not been arrested by this point, was present in the building, but he claimed to be working as a security guard. He was then shown a photo of David and revealed that he knew David was an informant. He added that on the 14th of October, David had arrived at the building to make another purchase, but they refused to do further business with him. A separate witness would then reveal that they saw David walking into the rear entrance of the building that day, and that they heard someone scream a short while later, followed by the sound of a firearm being discharged. Both men were charged with illegal substance conspiracy and the possession of an illegal firearm. Neither man was ever charged with ending David's life. Number 2. Usually, when someone agrees to become a police informant, they take part in a sting operation and are asked to testify against the criminal in question. When this is done, they're often able to carry on with their lives as usual. But this was not the case for 25-year-old Danielle Dresdowski. In 2014, she was living in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, in the Cary Avenue area. Her life had not turned out as planned, as she'd gotten involved with a notorious gang in the area known as the TF Mafia. The gang was known to be involved in several types of illegal activities, including human trafficking, the sale of illegal substances, and the sale of illegal firearms. Danielle was recruited by the group and had been working for them as a mule, but the police soon learned of this development. They kept an eye on Danielle, and in 2012, she was arrested. She was charged with conspiring to traffic an illegal substance, and she faced up to 5 years in jail. She agreed to work with the police as a confidential informant. This would see her receive a reduced sentence, though this is never guaranteed by the authorities when such an arrangement is made. On this occasion, she was sentenced to time served and then placed on probation. Having avoided jail time, she started providing investigators with information on the gang, but the group soon got wind that she was working as an informant, and their vengeance was horrific. Danielle was abducted and subjected to treatment that cannot even be mentioned here. The attack against her was so bad that she had to undergo reconstructive surgery, but she would eventually recover physically. The mental toll that the attack took on her would remain with her until her passing. In May of 2014, she was caught shoplifting and also charged with disorderly conduct. On the 20th of May, she attended a hearing, but in June of that year, she was released on the condition that she attend a substance abuse program at Ruth's Place shelter. But her time as an informant was by no means over. While she had supplied investigators with a wealth of information, she still had to testify against the members of the gang, and her appearance in court was scheduled for August of that year. When the day arrived, though, she failed to attend, and in April of 2015, when her family had still not been able to make contact with her, Danielle was reported as missing. By this time, she'd been listed as a fugitive by the FBI, and a reward for information leading to her capture was offered. No one has seen or heard from Danielle since, and her family is desperate to know what happened to her. Anyone who knows where Danielle is, or who has further information on her case, is asked to contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 570-697-2000. Number 1. It isn't often that an informant is asked to provide information on their spouse, but this is exactly what happened in the case of 27-year-old Lynda Spence, who was living in Glasgow, Scotland in 2011. At the time, Lynda was living a life of comfort while she was romantically involved with Sokol Safaj, a known Albion criminal. She often bought expensive gold jewelry and visited expensive nightclubs and casinos where she was seen drinking champagne, had purchased several apartments in the area, and drove a luxury vehicle. But it would later come to light that she too was on the wrong side of the law, since she'd supplied many people with fake passports while using fake names, including Lynda Riley, Lynda Safaj, Lynda De Bono, and Lynda Palmer. She'd been working as a call center employee at a local bank, but after just 5 years, she'd saved up enough money to open a financial advisory company. And here, she used fake documentation to secure property deals, and even stole money from known criminals living in Glasgow. At one point, she convinced a group of investors to fly to North Carolina, where they were supposed to meet up with someone who wanted them to invest in Danish bearer bonds, but it was all a ruse. She'd also had dealings with Colin Coates, a property developer who was known for his violent nature. At some point, she ended up owing him a lot of money, which eventually led to her demise. But while Lynda and Coates despised each other, he was not the real target that the police had in mind when they recruited her as an informant in 2011. Instead, they wanted her to provide them with information on Safaj, and she agreed. In an email sent from one of her many mailing accounts, she revealed that Safaj was involved with the sale of illegal substances, firearms, and running brothels. This must have come as quite a shock to Safaj, who admitted to being involved with her but denied the allegations against him. At trial, he stated they'd only been seeing each other romantically for about 12 months, and that the people often thought they were married due to her use of his last name as a pseudonym. But by this time, Lynda had gone missing. Her handlers with the police were made aware of her disappearance only 4 months after she vanished. It would later come to light that on the 14th of April that year, Lynda had met up with Coates and his associate, Philip Wade. They then forced her to drive to a property in West Kilbride, where she was tied to a chair and interrogated by 2 men, David Parker and Paul Smith, 2 addicts who were connected to Coates. Coates claimed that he wanted Lynda to repay the $114,000 that she owed him, and when she was unable to do so, her life was ended. They were charged with holding a person against their will and sentenced to 11 years and 3 months and 11 years in prison, respectively. Lynda's remains have never been found, and none of the people involved in her case has ever revealed any further details. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.